daf in Masechet Sanhedrin is 68, Samachet. And so we yesterday got to the last line of Samach Zayin Amabet, which was a quote from the Mishnah on Rabbi Akiva. If you recall, the Mishnah on Samach Zayin is talking about kishuf, about magic. And Rabbi Akiva says in the Mishnah, Mishum Rabbi Yoshua, that there could be two circumstances where you have a sorcerer, I'll use that word, collecting kishuim, collecting cucumbers or pumpkins or gourds or things of that nature. One does it with an act, and therefore they are a mechashef or mechashefa, and they're chayiv skila. And one does it with just achizat einayim, just they're not really gathering these gourds, they're just making it appear as if they are, and therefore they're pater. So that's what Rabbi Akiva said. Now says the Gemara today on the first word of Daf Samach Chet Amud Aleph, is it not even into the details of the Mishnah, but the Mishnah Rabbi Akiva quoted in the name of Rabbi Yehoshua that he learned this halacha. I asked the Gemara today, thinking back at the history, is it Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yeshua Gamerla? Did Rabbi Akiva really learn this from Rabbi Yehoshua? But Tanya, we have a following braita. It's going to be a lengthy braita, which is very interesting historically and halachically. But the only reason we're bringing it because we love learning and we're going to learn Yagdil Torah V'Yadir. But we also are going to see in this braita that Rabbi Akiva seems to have derived the rules of kishuim, of kishuf with kishuim from somebody else, from Rabbi Eliezer. So just remember, that's why we're bringing it. But let's go into the mindset of this long braita, which tells a really important story. So if you recall, there was a very famous story we've had many times in the Gemara of Rabbi Eliezer, who argued with the Chachamim in a very strong fashion about different tahara of objects. Remember the Tanur Shal Achnai, there's a certain oven that was taken apart in pieces, and the question was, is it still an oven? Is it still Mekabel Tuma? There were many other details in which he argued with the rabbis about Tuma and Tahara, and he didn't give in. So even when he was outvoted and the group voted the other way, the Chachamim decided against him, Rabbi Eliezer stuck with his opinions to such an extent that at some point they excommunicated him. They were minadehim. They pushed him out, and they said no one can learn with him, no one can approach him, because his opinions are not mainstream, call it that way. So now, that was the situation of Rabbi Eliezer. When he got sick, and of course in the Gemara when it talks about getting sick, usually a person gets sick before they die, right? Meaning they get sick and they're not going to get better. So Kishichala, says the Braita, now the second line, Kishichala Rabbi Eliezer, when Rabbi Eliezer got sick, so again, I don't know how many years after they had pushed him out, but Nichnisu Rabbi Akiva v'chavirav levakro. Rabbi Akiva and the other rabbis came to visit him because, this was probably the last opportunity. So hu yoshev b'kinuf shelo. He was sitting in his, not hospital bed, but kinuf literally means like a canopy bed, but he was in his room, let's say, in his section, Rabbi Eliezer. They didn't actually go in. They were sitting in the outside room. Not clear exactly what they were waiting for. They weren't sure if he was ready to receive them. Either way, they were right outside. And it was Friday afternoon, and it was getting close to candlelighting, getting close to time to start Shabbat. V'nichnas Hyrcanus beno, remember we had very famous Hyrcanus, the son of Eliezer, came in right before Shabbat was starting, lachlotz tfilav, to take off his father's tefillin. His father was sick in bed. Presumably he was too weak or not aware enough to take off his own tefillin. Again, that's questionable, and Hyrcanus came in to take off his tefillin. Ga'arbo, Rabbi Eliezer, means like he attacked him. He barked at him, and he said, "Get out of here!" Right? Like, get away from me. So he didn't let him do it. V'yatzab nizifa, and Hyrcanus left under, nizifa means he was depressed. He was embarrassed. He had been kicked out by his father. So Amar lahen lechavirav. So he said, Hyrcanus said to the other rabbi sitting there, "Kemeduma ani." It seems to me, shedato shel abba nitrifa. It seems that my father's losing his mind, that he's approaching the end. He's going, slipping out of consciousness. He doesn't really know what's happening. And that's why he kicked me out. He didn't know who I was or why I was coming, because Shabbos is about to start and I want to take off his tefillin. Rashi explains, Tosas goes through this a little bit, that, we don't wear tefillin on Shabbat. It's a D'Rabbanan. You might carry them in Rosh Hashanah. Of course, Rabbi Eliezer was not going to carry anything. He was laying in bed. So potentially it shouldn't be a problem, but the worry is they become muksa once you're not supposed to wear them. So anyways, we take off the tefillin before Shabbat. So Hyrcanus said, I thought my father is losing it. He's approaching the end. Amar lehen, so Eliezer, Rabbi Eliezer hears this from the other room, and he says, I am not, my mind is great. Dati v'dat, it's not my mind that's crazy. It's datcha. Where's the aleph? Let me just make sure the Bach says that. Um, Dato, right. Oh, okay, the Bach changes a little bit different. He says, Dato miyushavet, that my mind is okay. Dat imo, nitrafa, you or your mother, you and your family, you guys are losing your mind, meaning, why right before Shabbos are you coming here to deal with my tefillin? Heich minichin isur skila. How can you leave aside an isur skila of cooking, of lighting, there's so many things you do for Shabbos that you can't do them when Shabbos starts. It's an isur skila. Those are a much higher priority. Finish the cooking, finish lighting all the lights, and then oskim b'isur shvut. Instead, you're coming to deal with this isur of shvut, right? So why are you doing that? Meaning you should be dealing with other things, not because my tefillin don't need to come off, but that's not a priority. So again, just a real quick summary. So we're in the middle of a story of Rabbi Eliezer, who was very ill at the end of his life, like most people, I guess. And he had previously been minadeh, been excommunicated or pushed away by the Chachamim, so no one spent time with him. But as he was dying or getting close to his end, the rabbis came to visit him, and it's Erev Shabbat. So kivan shera'u chachamim shedatom yushavet alav, when the rabbis saw that he clearly was thinking straight, so it's worth having a discussion with him. Nichnesu, so they actually came in. V'yashvu lefanav, they sat in front of him, but they sat mirichuk arba amot. They kept the distance, which could be pretty awkward, right? I don't know how big the room was. Arba amot is 7 or 6 or 8 feet or so, whatever. So they stayed away from him because Rashi
They can
says
wear tefillin Shabbat. You find tefillin in the field, you can put them on and wear them. It's not muksa.
so. Again, we're not going to get into the Isser of tefillin. You're not allowed to walk outside with tefillin on Shabbat according to the Chachamim. There's a machloket about it. It's an Isser shvut. The issue with Rabbi Eliezer is that since you can't walk out with them, the concern was that you
I
shouldn't.
understand that, but if someone there's a way to carry them away, and one can't, according to
Right. But remember, that was a whole discussion. Remember, that was a discussion, but we didn't want you to carry them outright because that would be an Isser Doraita, right? So we permitted a lower Isser basically instead of doing a higher Isser. But this, as Rabbi Eliezer said, it's only an Isser Shvut. It's only an Isser Drabanan, right, or of Shvut, but it is prohibited. You should take off the tefillin. Either way, the rabbis come in. This is now Friday night, I guess. Maybe I don't know if it's before Shabbos or after Shabbos, but they're sitting at his room. Rabbi Eliezer's on his sick bed. They sit down. They don't go right next to him because he still is minudeh, meaning he's still pushed out. So they sit 4 amot away from him. And Amar Le, so Rabbi Eliezer says to them, Lama batem, why are you here? Right? You can see this kind of, Rabbi Eliezer was again not known for being the most agreeable person. And he's now very sick at the end of his life. So he says to them, why did you come? Amar Le, they said to him, well, Lomod Torah banu. We came to learn Torah. You are a repository. You're one of the greatest minds, or the greatest mind maybe, of Torah. We came to learn from you. Amalei, so he said to them, well, where have you been the last 20 years? Again, we don't really know. I don't know how long it really was, but a long time, right? Ad achshav lama lo batem. Why didn't you come till now? Where have you been? Of course, they each know, right? That this is not a secret that he was menudeh and that the rabbis kicked him out. But I guess this was the conversation to challenge each other. And Amar Lei said to them, they said to him, sorry, lo haya lanu pinai. We didn't find the time. Again, it's not clear what this whole back and forth is, right? In some ways, it's very insulting because when does that mean you didn't find the time? We couldn't find a moment to come in the last few years or something. But clearly, they didn't want to say the obvious, which is we didn't come because we're not allowed to come, right? So they were sort of dancing around it. So okay, that goes on. Amarlan, he says to them, Tamia ani, I would be amazed. Im yamut mitat atzman, if you die a natural death. Meaning, again, this is a terrible thing, and it's true, right? These were all the rabbis who ended up being the Harugei Malchut. It was a very tough time, of course. But Rabbi Eliezer said, again, I don't know if it's a curse or it's just a statement, I would be amazed, meaning you're not going to die a natural death. Amarla Rabbi Akiva, so Rabbi Akiva said, who was one of the people who went in to Rabbi Eliezer, Shalima, what about my death? Amarlo, he said, you're not spared. Shalcha kashem mishalem, yours is the worst. you're going to get the most perverse and uh, and difficult death. Rashi here says something ridiculous. Not sorry, I don't mean to say that. Rashi something here very extreme, which is that Rabbi Eliezer was saying to Rabbi Akiva, the reason that you are going to get a worse death is because you, Rabbi Akiva, have greater potential than everybody else. You could have learned more from me than anybody else. And the fact that you didn't come and learn from me means that you're essentially, Rabbi Eliezer is saying, being punished in a way, in the most extreme way, because you didn't do that. Now, again, the reason I say it's very extreme is that, of course, Rabbi Akiva couldn't, right? I mean, there was a nidui, and Rabbi Eliezer disagreed, but like it's quite a thing to say that your death is going to be the most horrible and terrible because you could have learned from me. But that is how Rashi explains it. Anyways, continues the Gemara. Natal shtei zera'otav. And Eliezer took his arms as if to, show an action. Benichan alibon, he crossed them, or he put them over his heart, and he said, Amar oy lechem shtei zerotav. Woe is to you, my two arms. Shehein kishtei sifrei Torah. They are like two scrolls of the Torah, sheniglalin, that are rolled up, meaning my body, my consciousness, including my hands, contains within it knowledge like two big sifrei Torah. Harbe Torah lamadati. I learned a lot of Torah, says Rebbe Eliezer. Harbe Torah limadati, and I taught a lot of Torah. But you know what? Harbe Torah lamadati, I learned so much Torah from my teachers, but it was like a drop in the bucket. Lo chasarti mi rabotai afilu kekelvim lakek min hayam. My teachers who taught me everything that they knew. I only absorbed from them like a dog licking up of water from the ocean, right? Like a drop in the sea. Meaning there's so much more to learn. I got whatever small amount I was able to get. And Harbe Torah limadati, I taught a lot of Torah in my day, and all the Torah I taught was only a fraction of what I knew, right? Well, chasarti talmidai, only lost me, I only gave over from my Talmud, like a little tiny, remember chol b'shofar is like the eyeshadow, like you dip it in and take a tiny bit out to put on as makeup. So meaning we only scratch the surface of the things that I know and the things that I learned. Below Od, said Rabbi Eliezer, El Shani Shoneh, I taught shalosh me'ot halachot bebaheret azah. I taught, meaning I learned and I mastered 300 details of the topic of tsarat of baheret azah, which means, in the white inside the color, right? What shades of white. I knew 300 details. Nobody ever asked me about them. I carry all this incredible, intense knowledge. Nobody cares. It made no impression on the world. No one asked me about it ever. Below Od, and this is getting to our point for a second, I taught I learned 300 halachot, and some say Amri shalosh alafim halachot, 3,000 halachot, in the aspects of nitiyat kishuim, of how you can do sorcery to plant and create gourds and pumpkins and cucumbers. So I know vast amounts of halachot about these details of what's kishuf and what's not kishuf and what they say. Again, I don't even know how you could have 300 or 3,000 halachot. But it says Rabbi Eliezer, I know all these things. Nobody cared enough to ask me. Nobody learned it from me. And I'm going to the grave with it, all being lost. Chutz, said Rabbi Eliezer, Akiva ben Yosef. The only person who ever tried to get my knowledge about what I know about this sorcery and planting or creating gourds, creating kishuim, was Akiva, Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef. Because Pam Achat, we're the second to last narrow line, one time, Ani v'hu mahalchin hayinu b'derech, we were once walking down the road, obviously in the old times, Amarli, and he said to me, Rebbe, lamdeni b'nitiyot kishuim. Rebbe, please teach me something about, this magic, this sorcery that I guess was pretty well known, described in our Mishnah, of Nitiyah literally means planting or creating kishuim. How does it work? Amarti davar echad. So I said to Rabbi Akiva, I didn't say to him, I said in front of him, one word or one statement, and Nitmali kol asadeh kishuim. I was able to fill a whole field of kishuim. So I showed him how it was done, basically, or I taught him how it was done, that you can do this kind of magic and you can create a field full of kishuim. Amarli, so Rabbi Akiva said to me, Rebbe, teacher, you taught me how to create them, how to plant them. How about how to uproot them, how to undo them? Limdeni akiratam. Can Can you teach me the opposite side? How do you get rid of them, or how do you uproot them? How do you collect them? So again, Amarti Davar Echad, I said one thing or one statement, and it kapsu kulam, the makom echad, and they all were uprooted and collected in one corner. So I know so much about it. I know 3,000 or 300 halachot about kishuim, and no one's ever asked me except for Akiva. Now, in a minute, we're going to say that's the question, because it seems like Rabbi Akiva learned his knowledge from Rabbi Eliezer, and in our Mishnah, we said Rabbi Akiva learned it from Rabbi Yoshua. So this is why we're bringing this whole Breita, just for the record. But we're not done with the Breita. Continues the story, the third wide line. Amrulo, so the rabbi said to Rabbi Eliezer, now there's a series of halachot in Masechet Kelim, which I'm not that familiar with, so I'm relying on Rashi here for my knowledge in Perek Chaf Gimel of Masechet Kelim, where there's a long discussion about how something is mikabel tuma, meaning, remember the basic halacha, this is very basic, and I'm not an expert in this, is that in order for an object to be mikabel tuma, meaning in order for take something that's say raw leather or any object or wood or whatever or metal, it's not mekabel tuman, it's a raw form, right? So if someone touches it and it's raw, it doesn't become tuma. It has to be a kli, it has to be a vessel. And there's a lot of discussion, many, many prakim, about what constitutes a vessel and what size and what inside. But one of the limudim that is a big discussion in Masechet Kelim is that the pasuk compares a beit or something that's leather to something that's sak. That's a sack, like a woven basket or bag. And that just like a sock, only a basket only is a mikabel tuma if it has what's called a beit kibul, meaning you could put something inside of it, right? It has to have a vessel to contain things. So too by leather is only mikabel tuma if it has a beit kibul, if it has something that you could put something in. And so the Mishnah goes through a set of cases where you basically have leather, which has something on the inside, but the function is that it's never filled and repeated, put in and out. And the best example is the first one, which is a softball, a baseball, right? So you take a baseball, right? It is a piece of leather on the outside. The inside is filled with whatever you put inside a baseball. I don't know, sand and rocks and feathers or whatever they had their baseballs were different than ours maybe. And so it is basically a leather object that contains something within it, right? But the thing that it contains within it is fixed. It's not meant to be taken in and taken out. You don't put stuff inside the baseball and use it to carry your diamonds and then put them out. So is that Makabel Tumah or not? So this is a big debate in the Masechet Kelim. Rabbi Eliezer has one opinion, which I think is that it is Makabel Tumah. Let me just see in a second. Yeah. And the Chachamim say it's not Mekabel Tumah because it doesn't really have a container on the inside that you put things in and out of. And so they basically asked Rabbi Eliezer on his deathbed, do you still maintain your position about that? Okay, so let me read that all inside. Amrulos, they said to him the following cases, a kadur, which is literally a ball I just described, the leather ball that contains something that's sewed up around it. Or amus. Now, amus, I don't know really in English, or amum is the girsa. It's basically
So this has a mema instead of a samech here.
yeah, so on the left that's amum, right? But either way,
Imum, in imum.
imum, it's a form that you would create a shoe around, right? So Rashi says, now we have these wooden forms and you put the leather around it to make the shoe. But in those days, they didn't have wood. They used a leather base, basically, where you took a piece of leather, you stitched it up, you filled it up with hard things so that it was solid, and then you put the shoe around that to make it, right? There must be a word for that. But basically, this stabilizer to put the shoe around itself is a piece of leather that's full of something. So it's the same concept, right? You never really open it up and take things in and out, but is it Mikabel Tuma? And a kamiyah, right? A kamiyah is a little amulet that you would take, and you would take a piece of leather and you'd put something inside it, like a scroll or jewels or whatever, and then you'd sew it up. So again, it was never meant to be taken in and out, but it did have something inside of it. And a tzur, right? Tzur Rashi says is something they would hang around the neck of a cow to prevent disease. But again, the same idea. It would be like a closed necklace, right? And sorry, margoliot, sorry, that they put the margoliot inside of. And mishkalot kitana, they had very small weights, right? So you had very small weights. You would worry that if you handle them, you basically rub off some of the metal, right? And therefore changes the weight. So to protect them, they would put a piece of leather around the weight. So again, the piece of leather is containing something inside of it, but it's never meant to be opened and closed, take in and out. So what's the halacha of tuma for all those things? Mahu. So Amar Lahen, so Rabbi Eliezer said, Hein Tmeim, they are tamei, okay, which is what he says in Kalim, and the Chachamim disagreed. And they said to him, the second detail about this is, let's say they become tamei. So even according to the Chachamim, they could become tamei if they open up, right? Let's say your baseball opens up and you can take things in and out of your baseball, take out the inside, and then a zav touches it, it becomes tamei, right? So how do you make it tahar, right? So usually if you make something tahar, you put it in a mikveh. But the question is, does the inside stuff make a chatzitza? You have to empty it out before you put it in the mikveh. So they said to him, Taratan bima, how do you make them tahar? Where am I? Taratan bima, how do you make them tahar? Right? And they also asked him, sorry, I lost my place. Here we go. But sorry, his answer was they are tmeim and taratam b'mashahin. They become tahar by putting them into the mikvah the way they are. Meaning, according to Rabbi Eliezer, you don't have to empty out the inside. It's not a chatzitza. It's considered to be an integral part of the thing. You just drop the whole baseball into the mikvah and it becomes tahar. Anyways, separate halacha of kalim. They then asked him, what about minal shal gabe aimum or emus, depending on the girsa? Let's say you have a shoe. You're making a shoe. It's on the form. You've crafted the whole shoe, but you haven't taken it off the form yet. Is it considered to be nigmar melacha? It's finished, in which case it's mekabel tuma. Or do you say, since it's not yet off the form, it's not mekabel tuma. It's not finished. It's not in the shop market, right? In the window. Mahu amar lam. So he said, no. My opinion, which is what he said in Kalim, is hu tahor. That shoe is still tahar because since it's still on the form, it's not finished. Anyways, that's his halacha. But then he died. V'yatsa nishmato b'tahara. And he died with the word tahar, which was a very good symbol that he had achieved tahara, purity of his life, I guess, in his death. Amad Rabbi Yeshua Raglav, to Rabbi Yeshua then stood up and said, Hutar haneder, Hutar haneder. We take back our neder that he's going to be excommunicated is now Hutar, and we could bury him with his regular respect and treat him like a regular person, because this is a siman that he's basically now accepted back into the community of the rabbis. Now, so that's where he died. The Motzei Shabbat, now, of course, they waited till after Shabbat to bury him. Motzei Shabbat, they were going to bury him. Pagaba Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, literally here, it doesn't mean he greeted him, it meant him, he stuck with him, meaning he stayed with the coffin, meaning Kesari Lelud. From the whole trip from Kesari to Lud, where they buried him, Hayam Makebib Saro, and Rabbi Akiva was hitting himself out of sorrow and pain, till he was bleeding to the ground from all his self-flagellation. Patach alav b'shura, and when they came to the shura, where they greet the mourners right after the burial, they started and said, V'amar, the psukim, of course, the very famous psukim of Elisha about Eliyahu, Avi, Avi, he was our father, Rechev Yisrael Parashav, he was the rider, the leader of Bnei Yisrael. And as Rabbi Akiva continued, he said, Harbei ma'ot yeshli, I have a lot of money, which here is, of course, a lot of knowledge, but I don't have someone who can explain it to me. The ainli shulchani lahartzotam. I don't have a money changer to make it, to change it for me. Meaning, we know so much, but we're missing now Rabbi Eliezer who could convert that knowledge into practical halacha. So that is the story. Beautiful, beautiful Braita. However, says the Gemara 4 lines from the bottom, what you see from this Braita is that Rabbi Akiva learned from Rabbi Eliezer, not Rabbi Yeshua. Says the Gemara, Alma me Rabbi Eliezer gamra, right? That he learned from Rabbi Eliezer. Answers the Gemara, you're right. Gamra me Rabbi Eliezer v'lo savra. He learned from Rabbi Eliezer first, but he didn't know. Rabbi Eliezer showed him how to do it, but he didn't actually explain it to him. He didn't understand it. V'hadar gamra me Rabbi Yeshua v'azbra nilei. Rabbi Akiva learned from Rabbi Yeshua and got a better explanation or a clearer explanation. So when Rabbi Akiva talks about in the Mishnah, he attributes that knowledge to Rabbi Yoshua. Ask the Gemara, but Hechi Avid Hachi, how in the world could Rabbi Eliezer do magic, right? I mean, you're not allowed to do kishuf. How could Rabbi Eliezer do the kishuf and make the field full of diluim and then collect them? That's not, that's michashefa. How could Rabbi Eliezer do that? Hanansnan, we learned in the Mishnah, Hoset Ma'aseh Chayav, if you do an act of kishuf, you're chayav. So how can Rabbi Eliezer have done that? Says the Gemara, well, Hitlamed Shani. He was not doing it for the purpose of doing it. He was doing it to teach others how it's done. And that's different. The Amar Mars, we've quoted many times before. It says, Lo tilmad la'asot. Don't learn from the goyim to do their actions. La'asot yatalamad. You can't learn it to do it. Avatalamad lahavinu laharot. You're allowed to learn about magic in this case, or avodah zarah in that case, in order to teach about it and to paskin to know what's appropriate. So that's how Rebbe Eliezer did it, not for his own personal belief in magic, but in order to understand what the Gemara means when it talks about Michashefa. Hadra Alach Arba Mitot, and that concludes this parak. Continues the Gemara, turn the page, is Af Samachet on Mabet. The next case, which is another case of Skila, we're not done with Skila yet, is Ben Sorer Umoreh, right? The very famous and controversial, I would say, or complicated case of a son who goes off the path and steals some money and eats some meat, that we take that son out to court and we stone him. Says the Mishnah, Me'ematai na'aseh ben sorer umoreh, right? The word ben implies he's a son, but he's also has to be an adult, we think, or close to an adult. So what is considered to be the age that a person can be a ben sorer umoreh? Says the Mishnah, Mishiyavish de sarot. It's from the time that he has two pubic hairs, right? Which is always, not always, but is the time of quote unquote adulthood. And that's when it starts. But it doesn't go for very long because he has to still be a ben, not an adult, basically. So ad shiakif zakana tachton, right? Well, ad shiakif zakan is probably how you read it. Until he grows, zakan literally means a beard, but Mishnah clarifies we're not really referring to facial hair, referring to pubic hair. Hatachton v'lo ha'elyon, the bottom hair and not the top one. So meaning, and we'll see in the Gemara in the Shiurim, but there's a time from when he initially starts having pubic hair until he has enough of it that it's considered to be an adult, basically. Ella, says the Gemara, the Mishnah, Shedibru Chachamim b'lashon kiyah. The reason they said Yakif Zakan, that he has a beard, is that they wanted to speak about something cleaner, meaning facial hair, even though it's not what it refers to. Shenem, now, how do we know this? What's the source for this? Because the pasuk says, Kiyeh leish ben, if a person has a son, and that tells you ben v'lobat. We'll see in the Gemara why, but we don't know why, but the Gemara is going to explain this. A son, not a daughter, but ben v'lo ish. He has to be a son, but not a full-grown man. So there is a maximum age for ben sorer umoreh, but says the Mishnah, katan patur, but if he's still a minor, he'd be patur shlo balach lal mitzvot, because there's no commandments on a katan. So there has to be some middle ground between not a katan, not an ish, where he's in the status of ben. Says the Gemara now, katan menalan de patur. Now, oh, wait a second. How do we know that a katan is actually patur? Right? Meaning, well, the Gemara is going to speak out what the question is, but how do we know that a katan is patur from being ben sorer umoreh? Let's say he's 8 years old. How do you know that he's not chayav? Says, what do you mean minalan? What kind of question is that? The Mishnah just said, Kidiktani Tama, the Mishnah just said, quote, Shalo balach lal mitzvot. Right? The Mishnah just said a katan's not included because he's not included in mitzvot. A ish is not included because he's too old, and it's somewhere in the middle. What's your question? The two, and furthermore, why would you ever ask me why a katan needs a proof to be patur? Heicha ashichan da anasha katuv. Where in the world have you ever found a case where the Torah punishes a katan, and you have to ask me, why don't you punish this katan? The hacha liboy kra lemiftere. You need a pasuk to patur him. So I don't understand the question. This Gemara, sorry, let me explain. We spoke a little too fast. Anan, we are in the middle of the line, I think 9 lines from the top. Anan hachi kamrinon. This is the question we were asking. Look, ben sorer umoreh is clearly a unique case in the Torah. It's not similar to anything else, right? Because a ben sorer umoreh is not killed for the sin. And we quoted this earlier, and we're going to discuss it more later, right? That a ben sorer umoreh does a little, he steals a little bit of money, eats a little bit of meat. That's not a capital punishment, right? He's not being sinned for what he did. He's being sinned for what we think it portends about his future, right? Says the Gemara, Atu ben sorer umoreh cheto nerag. You think you're killing a ben sorer umoreh because of the sin that he committed? Al shem sofo nerag. You're killing him because of what we think will come from this, what this portends. But says the Gemara then, kivad al shem sofo nerag. If he's being killed for the future, not for what he's doing now, maybe his age doesn't matter. Afilu katan nami. Maybe his age doesn't matter, and you could say he's 9 years old, but if he's got really bad behaviors and ingrained attitudes, maybe we should kill him because he's going to become really, really rotten in the future. So maybe this is not like every other mitzvah in the Torah where we punish you for what you did, and then we would never punish a katan because they're not included. Maybe here we're punishing you for the future, and we should include a katan. The ode, and furthermore, the pasuk says the word ben. right? It specifically says a ben sorera moreh. So maybe the pasuk is specifically saying not ben velo ish, a boy who's not yet a man, and implying a katan mashma. So maybe in fact a katan should be included. So when our Mishnah said that a katan's not included because not b'chalal mitzvot, my question was, I hear you, Mishnah, but why don't you say you kill a katan even though he's not b'chalal mitzvot because we're punishing him for the future? So says Rav Yudah Marav, well, the answer then to that is right before the two dots, the Amar Krab, because the pasuk says v'chi yiyeh leish ben, right? It says that it's a little bit of a strange terminology, right? And we're going to dash in a little bit more, right? But because it says when a person, an ish has a ben, right? Meaning, and it could have said probably chiyeh ben, right? Why do we say leish ben, right? Who else has a son? So basically, it's telling you that he's got to be both close to an ish and a ben, meaning a ben, a child, has samuch ligvurato shel ish, who is close to the power and the strength and the maturity of a man. So that the pasuk is basically telling you, don't include a very young person, which is before puberty. Don't include an older person who's above what we call yakif zakan, a sufficient amount of growth, and somewhere in between. So that is learned from the pasuk. We're gonna expand on this a little bit as we go further. The Mishnah then continued and said, "What's the maximum age for a ben sorera moreh? That is ad yakif zakan, right? Until the literal words mean that his beard um, uh, grows, let's say, or we'll see what the word means, is large enough, is yakif means surrounds. And we say tachton v'lo elyon, right? The bottom, not the top. Tani Rabbi Chia, what that means is ad yakif atara, until the hair, the pubic hair in this case, grows in a crown, meaning it grows in a whole circle. It's not one or two or three spots somewhere. It's basically around the whole area of growth. Kiat Rav Dimi Amar, Rav Dimi came, he explained it means referring to Hakafat Gid, where it goes around the actual penis itself, below Hakafat Beitzim, and not hair around the Beitzim, around the testicles, which actually takes later. So this is an earlier Zman. Okay, so that is the Shirim of Rabbi Chia and Rav Dimi. I don't know exactly when those times are. I guess it probably depends on the kid, but whatever it is, it's some amount of time, 6 months, a year, or some amount of time after the initial signs of puberty. Now, says Rav Chisda, and again, we're going to get back to the psukim in a second. Says Rav Chisda, a katan shaholid, if you have a minor who gives birth to a son, let's say you have a 12-year-old boy who gives birth to a child, when that child grows up, ein beno naseh ben sorera moreh, his son, meaning the son of the katan, cannot become a ben sorera moreh. 13 years later, that child of this very, very young boy, who's now going to be in his 20s, turns to be a ben sorera moreh. We don't carry out the judgment on that kid. Shenemar, because the pasuk says, "Ki yiyeh leish ben," when a man has a son, meaning that an ish has to have a ben. The only time there's ben sorera moreh is if an adult, which of course the Gemara describes as 13 or older, has a son. But lo leben ben, not if a boy has a boy, then that kid will not be included in ben sorera moreh. Says the Gemara, one second, you just said that pasuk was needed. You just used that pasuk for Rabbi Yehuda Marav to tell you that it's referring to a kid who's a ben samuch leish. So you need to have the words ish and the word ben to tell you that. How could you learn something else from the pasuk to tell you that the son has to be of a man, not the son of a son? In Cain, says Yehuda Marav would say to you, well, you're right, but the Torah could have just said, Lemakra ki ben leish. It could have said, Kiya ben, which is what it would have said normally, leish, and added the word to a man to tell you that ben has to be close to an ish, right? Why did it switch the order, which is a little bit unusual? My kiya leish ben, why put the ish first? Shema min like Rav Chisda. So you learn basically Rav Chisda, which is two things, right? So one, well, right now we think it's two things, right? So it's two things, meaning that a boy who gives birth to another son, a 12-year-old or 11-year-old or whatever, is that son can never become a ben sorera moreh, and the ben sorera moreh of an adult has to be a boy who's samuch leish. Ask him, well, how do you know you learned the second thing? Maybe it all comes to tell you the first thing, which is that a ben who gives birth to a ben can't have a ben sorera moreh, but only an ish. Says, well, in Cain, imakra ben ish. And it could have just said the word ben ish, my ish ben shma min atarti. So basically, the fact that it said the order ish ben tells you that the ish has to give birth to a ben, and the fact that it said both words ish and ben tell you that the person who's involved in ben sorer or moreh has to be a ben samuch leish, which our Mishnah defined as a boy who has already achieved shtei sarot, so two pubic hairs, which is our usual definition of maturity, but has not yet had sufficient growth of pubic hairs to be an ish. And that we define that as a crown, whatever that means. So that is what we learn from the Mishnah. It says the Gemara, though, 4 lines in the bottom, last word on the line, this whole idea is pliga derabba, right? This whole concept that you have to have a pasuk that tells you that if a boy gives birth to a son, that son can't be a ben sorel moreh, argues with Rabbah, because Rabbah says elsewhere, Damar Rabbah, katanina molid. Rabbah is of the opinion that a minor cannot conceive a child, right? Rabbah is of the opinion that a 12-year-old, let's say, or 11-year-old, or whatever age, cannot father a child. And a katan inu molid. And therefore, you don't need a pasuk to tell you that a child of a minor can't be a ben soreh moreh. There's no such thing as a child of a minor, according to Rabbah. And where did Rabbah say that? Shenemar, because the pasuk in the beginning of Bamidbar, right, talks about im ein leish goel, right? It's talking about a case where a person dies and they have nobody who is goel. So remember, what do we do with their possessions, right? What happens to it, right? It goes to Hefker, etc. So now ask the Gemara, and we've talked about this before. What do you mean im ein leish goel? If a person dies without an inheritor, everyone has an inheritor, right? You might not have a first degree, but everyone goes back to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And so if you go up many, many, many generations, you can always find somebody who's related to someone. Is there someone in Yisrael who doesn't have a goel? Ella, of course, as we understand the psukim in this parsha in the end of Bamidbar, it's referring to Gezel Hager, referring to a case where you stole from a ger, right? The ger then died, and you have no one to return that to, right? So you stole it from a convert. Remember, a convert has, as we discussed actually a few weeks ago, convert has no relatives, right? The people who are related to that convert before they died are no longer their relatives. And let's say the convert had no children. So they die, they have absolutely no relatives. You stole from that person, you have to return it to him. He's not alive, he has no one to give it back to. So that's what the Gezel Hager pasuk talks about, what you do with the money. So says Rabbah, so says the Mishnah, sorry, the Braita, the Gezel Hager katuv medaber, right? The pasuk is referring to Gezel Hager. Now, interestingly, in that pasuk, right, the pasuk says im ein leish goel. It says, it doesn't say v'im ein goel, if there's no person to redeem them. It says if the man has no one to redeem them. Why does it say the word ish, right? Amar Achmani ish, the Torah, the top word now of Daf Samach Tet Amud Aleph, the Torah says the word ish to tell you that only, this is Rabbah's statement, ish atat tzarich lachzor alav im yesh lo goalim v'im lav, right? Only a man, meaning an adult, which is 13, and sarot, you have to investigate, did that person conceive a child? Is there a baby anywhere in the world or a relative anywhere in the world that is a descendant of this ger? But that's only if the ger is an ish. But if it's a katan, if the ger died and was 12 or 10 or whatever, you don't have to chase after and look and determine, did that person father any children? Because biyadua she'en lo goalim, you know for a fact that the person has no goalim. So Rabbah basically said the pasuk is telling you that it's only a man, an adult, who you have to worry and look after and see if you can find the goel. But by definition, a person who's not an ish cannot have children. In which case, the whole limud of Rav Chisda doesn't make any sense, right? It was Rav Chisda, right? The whole limud of Rav Chisda, yeah, doesn't make any sense because Rav Chisda said that the part of the pasuk is ki yiyeh leish ben soreh moreh, not a ben who has a ben soreh moreh. But according to Rabbah, that is completely impossible, and a child can never conceive and give birth to a child. Well, obviously not give birth, but conceive a child. Now, that's the beginning of that discussion. I'll just say we're stopping here because that's how Daf Yomi works. But we're about to continue a much more detailed discussion about this question. Do we worry that a person who's 12 or 11 can conceive and have a child? And if so, what does it mean in different halachot? So continue tomorrow from the fourth line of Daf Samach
If
Tet.
he steals from here, if he steals from, we're talking about the ger who is not an ish, right? He's
No,
he's
no.
less than an ish, so therefore you don't have to search for the children. But at what point do we say there's a whole Gemara in Ketubah, I think, where the person isn't even considered a ger and matbin they beitin until he becomes age 13 anyway, so you can't even consider him a ger. So how are we stealing from him, and to what restitution do we have to make to someone who's not considered a ger yet? He's not an ish. He's not the 13.
So it's a great question. And I would say that if you have some free time today, I'd advise you to look at Tosfot, who has a very, very, very lengthy discussion about this. It's the Tosfot is actually moved from where it should be to earlier, to last page, Samachet Amabet, Tosfot Katan, who goes through a very, very, very long discussion about whether there are cases in which, in fact, you would be chayav for a katan or not. But it's really detailed. So we'll leave it at that, but it's a great question. Right? So there are, I mean, he goes through all kinds of different details. Can you do zechiyah to a katan aide acher? Right? Let's take that one as one example. Can you give something to a katan? Not they can't achieve it, but can you give it to them through somebody else? Again, these are many, many, many questions. He points to a Mishnah in where's the Mishnah? In Bava Batra, which we had, that remember, you're not allowed to steal from a Katam mipnei darkei shalom, right? Which he says is problematic, implying that there's no Isser Doraita of that. So anyways, it's a really good question. I'll refer you to Tosfot, and I don't have a quick answer. But tomorrow, we will continue the discussion of what's considered to be a Katan in terms of whether a Katan can give birth or not give birth. So Shavua Tov, everyone. Hope everyone joins tomorrow, and I will see you again next Motzei Shabbat, God willing. Thank you.